or colleges and universities. And if residential segregation is as unconstitutional as any of these other forms of segregation that we abolished, then all of us, as citizens of this democracy, have an obligation to do something about it. Not just that it'd be a good idea to do something about it, we have an obligation to do something about it, if in fact it's a systematic government policy that violates the civil rights of African Americans systematically. Well, I began this investigation that led to this book, and I came to the conclusion, as you all know, that we do have a systematic segregation of neighborhoods by government policy, by law, by regulation, and that the policy was so powerful that it still determines residential boundaries today because we've never remedied them. So let me spend a few minutes describing some of the policies that the government followed to not only segregate neighborhoods, but policies that were so powerful that they determine the landscape today. I can't describe all of them, but let me just touch on a few of them. Let me begin by talking about public housing. Now, all of us I know think we know what public housing is. It's a place where poor people live. It's a place where there are lots of mothers with children, single mothers with children, lots of young men without participation in the formal economy, frequently acting out, attracting the attention of the police, engaging in a cycle of violence with the police, getting incarcerated. That's our image of public housing. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country as a program for working and middle-class families during the Great Depression. It was one of the first programs implemented by the New Deal, by Franklin Roosevelt's administration. Poor people were not permitted into public housing. This was a program for working families. It was for families where the husband was employed among the 75% of the workforce that was employed, not the 25% that was unemployed. In order to get into public housing, a social worker would visit the homes of public housing applicants and make sure that their children were well behaved and that they had good furniture, high quality furniture that would maintain the high standards of public housing. Applicants had to show a stable employment record. And everywhere the federal government segregated the housing that it built. Even and frequently segregating neighborhoods that hadn't previously been integrated. That may surprise you, but in fact in the early 20th century, there were many, many integrated neighborhoods in this country, especially in downtown areas, in urban areas. We would be stunned if we could somehow be transported back to downtown urban areas throughout the country in the mid-20th century to see the extent of integration that existed. I don't know if about a month and a half ago, Linda Brown passed away. I don't know if any of you read the obituary. Linda Brown was the daughter of the plaintiff in Brown versus Board of Education. She went to a segregated school, and that was the lead case in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. But if you read her obituary, as I did in the newspaper, I was surprised, or I guess that's not true. I wasn't surprised anymore. Maybe you were surprised to learn that while Linda Brown went to a segregated school, she lived in an integrated neighborhood in Topeka, Kansas. Her playmates were both white and black. And this, I say, was not unusual in the 20th century. It wasn't unusual for the simple reason that workers didn't have automobiles to get to work. And most jobs were located in the downtown area. And so if you had a factory district where there were workers who were Irish immigrants or Italian immigrants or African Americans or Jewish immigrants or rural migrants, they all had to live in broadly the same areas. So they could walk to work or take short streetcar rides to get to work. So integration was not unusual, even in the South. The South may have had segregated water fountains, but it didn't have segregated housing. It was integrated in many, many parts of the South. Some of you may remember, or if you don't remember, may have read the autobiography of the great African-American novelist, the playwright, poet Langston Hughes. It's called The Big C. In his autobiography, he describes how he grew up in an integrated Cleveland neighborhood. He says that his best friend was Polish in high school. He dated a Jewish girl. As I say, this was not unique in the United States of the 20th century. But the Public Works Administration, one of the first agencies created by the New Deal, demolished integrated housing in that neighborhood where Langston Hughes grew up and created two separate projects, one for African Americans and one for whites, creating a pattern of segregation in Cleveland that otherwise might never have developed in the strength that it did. It built other housing projects elsewhere that were also segregated in Cleveland, and helped to determine the future growth, the pattern of growth in Cleveland. And I want to emphasize, this was an integrated neighborhood beforehand. There was a big housing shortage. If the Public Housing Administration, or the Public Works Administration rather, had built integrated housing, there might have been some white families who wouldn't want to live in an integrated building even though they were living in an integrated neighborhood. But there was such an enormous housing shortage that for every family that refused to live in an integrated setting, there were 10 willing to take its place. So this was not in any way a necessary policy. And they did this throughout the country. Here in Cambridge, the area that you know as Central Square was an integrated neighborhood. It was about half black and half white, and I owe a lot of this research to Bill Cunningham, who's here this evening, and one of the best historians I know, working on an amateur basis, categorizing the history of his city. But the Central Square neighborhood was half white, half black, roughly speaking, and the Public Works Administration built two separate projects there, creating segregation that hadn't previously existed. Elsewhere in the Boston area, other segregated projects were created. Mission Hill was the site of two projects, Mission Hill and Mission Hill East. One was Mission Hill was for whites. Mission Hill East was for African Americans. And by the way, this is not because whites happen to like the name Mission Hill and blacks happen to like the name Mission Hill East, and so they applied to different projects. These were labeled explicitly by race. This is how people were assigned to public housing in that period. The subtitle of my book is called A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. It wasn't hidden. There was nothing hidden about this policy. It's something that we've all forgotten, that we've used to rationalize this myth of de facto segregation. Even in the South, as I mentioned, there was an area near downtown Atlanta called the Flats. There was an integrated neighborhood, racial composition pretty similar to that of the Central Square neighborhood here. And the Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood to build a project for whites only, forcing African Americans whose homes had been destroyed to find housing doubled up with relatives elsewhere, less adequate housing. During World War II, the government's efforts to segregate the nation accentuated. At that time, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production to take jobs that had been scarce during the Depression. The government had to build housing for these workers. They were overwhelming the cities where the jeeps and the tanks and the aircraft and the ships were being built. And if the government wanted those ships and tanks and aircraft and jeeps to come off the assembly lines, they had to find housing for the workers. In my book, I talk about another area of the country that's as self-satisfied as Cambridge. It's a place called Berkeley, California. And a suburb of Berkeley was a deepwater port, a little town, a suburb called Richmond. And that's where the Kaiser shipyards were built, the largest shipbuilding operation in the West Coast during the war. It was a small town, about 20,000 people at the beginning of the war, all white. There were very few African Americans living on its outskirts and working as domestics in white families' homes, but this was not a segregated community. There were no shipyards there before the war. By the end of the war, Kaiser had employed 100,000 people. If you consider their families, probably the influx of population was 300,000. I don't know how a community of 20,000 absorbs 300,000 people in just a 4-year period. It's clearly impossible. The government had to provide housing for these workers, and so it did. The government built housing for the African American workers, separate housing, along the railroad tracks and in the industrial area. It was temporary housing, shoddy housing, because the city of Richmond announced that any African Americans who came to the city during the war to work in the shipyards would have to leave at the end of the war. But whites were welcome to stay, and the federal government built housing for the white workers in the residential areas further inland. It built a project in Berkeley that the city refused to participate in, said it didn't want to change the character of the community by accepting housing for war workers. So the federal government built housing for African Americans in Berkeley, again near the railroad tracks, and for whites, separate housing along the main road where the shopping area, shopping district was located, all for the workers in these shipyards. This was a pattern throughout the country, war housing being used to create patterns of segregation that otherwise would never have existed. I mean, there were certainly patterns of segregation in some parts of the country, and particularly in the East, in big industrial cities of the East, where there had been large African American migrations during World War I, places like Detroit or Chicago or Pittsburgh. But not in California. There were very few African Americans living in California before World War II. The segregation patterns that developed in both Northern and Southern California during World War II were purely a government creation. And we actually have a proof, one proof, about how unnecessary this policy was, even in a practical sense. Because there was one shipyard on the other side of the bay in Marin County called Marin Ship, which grew so rapidly that they couldn't accommodate anything but single men. Families were not permitted to migrate to Marin City during the war. At the beginning of the shipyards was built, and they arrived so rapidly as the shipyard was growing that the administrators of the shipyards just handed out pillows and blankets and sent them off to barracks that had been built for single men. And they had no time to segregate it, so this was integrated barracks housing. And it worked out so well that when they came to build housing for the families that arrived later, they built integrated housing. It's the only example I know of anywhere in the country where the federal government built integrated housing for war workers, simply because it started out because of the necessity of them arriving so rapidly. But it's an indication of how even practically unnecessary, how unjustifiable the federal government's policy was. After World War II, there was still an enormous housing shortage in the country. And not only had no housing been built in the Depression except for these public projects that I described, and during World War II it was prohibited to use construction materials for civilian purposes except for housing for war workers. And then after World War II there were millions of returning war veterans who came home needing housing, forming families, having no place to live, living in Quonset huts and doubled up with relatives. So President Truman proposed a vast expansion of the National Public Housing Program. And remember, we're talking about housing for working people, not for poor people. These were returning war veterans, both black and white, who had jobs in the post-war boom. The white workers had better jobs than the African Americans, but they all had jobs, and President Truman needed to house them. So he proposed a vast expansion of the National Housing Program, public housing program. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat this expansion of public housing. They wanted to defeat it not for racial reasons, obviously. It was segregated everywhere. That's the way the government built housing. They didn't want to defeat it because they didn't like poor people. This housing wasn't for poor people. It was for working class, returning war veterans. They wanted to defeat it simply because they thought that public housing was socialistic, and the government shouldn't be involved in the housing market, and the private sector should take care of the needs of war veterans, even though the private sector wasn't taking care of those needs. And so they came up with a legislative strategy that has been used in other cases as well. We call it a poison pill strategy. Some of you, I think, have probably heard that term. A poison pill strategy is a strategy of opponents of a bill in Congress who attach an amendment to a bill which they think can get a majority, and so it will get attached to the bill. But the amendment, when attached to the bill, makes the full bill unpalatable, and so the full bill goes down to defeat, a poison pill amendment. And so conservatives in Congress proposed the following amendment, and a few of you are old enough to remember these names. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio was the leading conservative in Congress at that time, a Republican senator. He proposed an amendment to the 1949 National Housing Act that said, from now on, no more discrimination, racial discrimination in public housing. No more segregation. We've got to have integrated public housing from this point forward. Now, it was a cynical proposal on his part. He didn't want public housing at all. But his strategy was that he would get his fellow conservatives to vote for this amendment. He would be joined by Northern liberal Democrats who would vote for integration in housing. That would create a majority. The bill would then be attached, the amendment would then be attached to the bill. But then when the full bill came up to the floor prohibiting segregation in public housing, the conservatives would flip and vote against the final bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats. That would create a new majority, and the bill would go down to defeat. So if there's nothing you remember from this talk I give tonight, I want you to remember this following story. Liberals in Congress campaigned against the Integration Amendment. They campaigned against the Integration Amendment because they realized that if the Integration Amendment was defeated, there might not be any public housing. I mean, it was passed. If the Integration Amendment passed, there might not be any public housing. They were led by Hubert Humphrey, Mr. Civil Rights in the United States Senate. Just the previous year, he had won a name for himself by demanding a civil rights plank in the Democratic Party platform, forcing a walkout of Southern segregationists from the Democratic Party. So Mr. Civil Rights led a campaign against the Integration Amendment. He was joined by another leading liberal, Senator Paul Douglas. Senator Paul Douglas got up on the floor of Congress and made a speech along the following lines. He said, I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off with the bill without this amendment than you will be if we pass the Integration Amendment and no housing gets built. He persuaded his Northern liberal colleagues to vote against the Integration Amendment. It was defeated. The full housing bill came up before Congress, and it was passed. And under that bill, many of the largest public housing projects in the country that we're familiar with today, that still exist in many cases, were built. Very soon after this act was passed and these public housing projects were built, places like, well, in Chicago, the Robert Taylor Homes, or Cabrini Green, you may have heard of, or in St. Louis, Pruitt-Igoe. Pruitt-Igoe is actually two projects. Pruitt was for African Americans. Igoe was for whites. It wasn't the Pruitt-Igoe project. It was the two projects. Very soon afterwards, after these projects were built, a development occurred everywhere, and that is that large numbers of vacancies developed in the white projects and large numbers of long waiting lists in the black projects. Pretty soon the situation became so conspicuous that the government had to open up all the projects to African Americans. You couldn't have projects in the same city, some of which were vacant and others had long waiting lists. Projects, public housing, became increasingly African American, soon almost all African American as the whites departed. At about the same time, industry left the cities. We no longer needed to have industries located either on deep water ports, rivers, or near railroad stations. Highways were being built, and industry could move out to suburban areas. So the African Americans who are now living in public housing and only African Americans in public housing virtually no longer had access to good jobs. They became poorer and poorer. Soon the federal government had to subsidize their rents. Previously, they were paying the full cost of the public housing and their rents. It wasn't costing the government anything. But soon they lost jobs. Government had to subsidize their rents. Once the subsidies began, the government stopped maintaining the buildings. They deteriorated, and they became the kinds of concentrated areas of disadvantage that we're familiar with today. But we should remember that that's not how public housing began. Well, the big question is, why did all the vacancies develop in the white projects and not in the black projects? These were all people who had jobs in the post-war boom. There's no obvious reason why you should have had vacancies in the white projects and not the black projects. But the reason was another federal program that was even more powerful in creating segregation than the public housing program. And that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration that was designed to suburbanize the entire white population into single-family homes in all white suburbs. This creation of all white suburbs was not the unintended consequence of some benign policy. It was an explicit racial policy of the federal government designed to get whites to move into all white suburbs and prohibit African Americans from doing so. And you're familiar with many of these suburbs that were built. They were built all over the country. Suburbanization proceeded rapidly in the 1950s and 1960s. The most famous of these developments is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes east of New York City. Where was Levitt going to get the capital to build 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers? It's impossible. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him money to build 17,000 homes for which he hadn't sold a single one yet. The only way that Levitt could get this capital was to go to the federal government, the Federal Housing Administration, submit his full plans for the development, including the materials he was going to use and the architectural design and the layout of the streets, and an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required Levitt and all of these other developers to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. This was specified in the underwriting manual of the Federal Housing Administration, a manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate developers' proposals for these suburban developments. And the manual specified that no approval could be granted to a development that would be integrated, and further, that no approval could be granted to a development that was close enough to where African Americans were living that it ran, in the words of the manual, the risk of infiltration by incompatible racial elements. This was federal policy. This was not the unintended effect of consequence of benign policies. Nothing de facto about this. It was written. It was implemented nationwide. There were hundreds and hundreds of these suburbs built in every part of the country. I mentioned Levittown. Some of you may remember Pete Seeger singing a song written by Malvina Reynolds about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tack, and they all live the same. That was about a development as large as Levittown, south of San Francisco. And same thing, commitment never to sell a home to an African American, and a requirement of deeds in that prohibited resale to African Americans. Los Angeles became the biggest symbol of suburbanization in the country in the 1950s. Developments like Lakewood, some of you may be familiar with Los Angeles, near the McDonnell Douglas plant, or Westchester, built by Kaiser after he was no longer building ships and had to go into another business. Panorama City and the San Fernando Valley. All of these were developments that were financed by the Federal Housing Administration with a prohibition that against African Americans living there for white, mostly returning war veterans. In one case, I have a picture of this in my book. A developer in Detroit wanted to build an all-white development. The Federal Housing Administration thought that it was located too near where African Americans were living, but they agreed to give him a loan guarantee if he would construct a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall separating his development from the nearby African American neighborhood. He did so, and he got the federal guarantee. These two policies, and there were many others, and I describe many of them in my book. I don't have time to go into them this evening. But these two policies, the concentration, what wound up to be the concentration of African Americans in places without jobs, in urban areas, and the surrounding, the creation of a white noose around those neighborhoods for single-family homes of white families only, were the two policies that were primarily responsible for segregating the country. Why do I say that the policies were so powerful that they determine our racial landscape today? They actually determine not only our racial landscape, but most of the racial inequality and many of the most serious social problems that we face in this country today. I say that because the homes in places like Levittown, excuse me, or the little boxes on the hillside, Westlake and San Francisco, or Westchester in Los Angeles, these homes at the time sold for, in today's inflation-adjusted dollars, about $100,000 apiece. Any working-class family, that's twice national median income, any working-class family can afford to buy a home for twice national median income, especially if they have a VA mortgage with no down payment required. White families were able to buy those homes. African Americans who could equally have afforded them were prohibited from doing so. Over the next couple of generations, those homes gained appreciation. They're now worth, in Westlake or in Westchester or in Levittown, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 or more. The white families who bought those homes, subsidized by the federal government, I say subsidized, the incentive of this FHA and VA mortgages on a racial basis was so powerful that whites could leave public housing and move to single-family homes in these FHA and VA-financed suburbs and pay less in their monthly housing costs than they were paying for rent in public housing. These white families who bought these homes gained over the next couple of generations, as a result of the appreciation, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in wealth. Most families in this country who have any wealth at all get it from the equity they have in their homes. The white families who gained this wealth were able to use it to send their children to college. They were able to use it to take care of emergencies that might arise, whether temporary unemployment or medical emergencies. They used it to bequeath that wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments of their own to buy homes. African Americans who were prohibited from participating in this suburbanization gained none of that wealth and continued renting either in public housing or in the private market in urban areas. As a result, today, African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes, 60%. There's a story of government participation there as well, but I won't go into it here. But 60%. African American wealth is 10% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century and that's never been remedied. It, of course, not only determines the continued segregation residentially of our communities. As I began by saying, it determines the achievement gap in schools. It determines the health gap between African Americans and whites, shorter life expectancies, worse health outcomes for African Americans living in neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage. It predicts the mass incarceration, which could not exist if young men from disadvantaged families were not being concentrated in single urban areas. It predicts lack of mobility, of racial mobility. We know, for example, that African American children who are poor, from poor families living in a segregated neighborhood, are much less likely to have middle-class incomes as adults than equally poor African American children who are growing up in a less segregated neighborhood. We have lots of discussion among progressives about how to address each of these symptoms, but the underlying cause, the unconstitutional residential segregation of our neighborhoods, is something that we rarely discuss and certainly have no policies on the agenda to deal with. We do have a lot of efforts to build, not very successful, but they're efforts to build more affordable housing for low-income families, to deal with homeless problems. always placing these developments primarily in already existing segregated low-income neighborhoods, perpetuating the underlying cause of these problems rather than dealing with it. We're never going to be able to develop the kind of mobilization that we need in this country to address residential segregation unless we understand this history. Because so long as we, as I said, as long as we think it happened by accident, it's easy to believe it can only unhappen by accident, and so long as we believe it happened by accident, the Supreme Court is going to prohibit us from doing anything about it. So obviously the first thing we need to do, it's not the only thing we need to do, but the first thing we need to do is broaden the understanding of this history. One of the places to start is in our local schools. In the course of writing this book, I examined the textbooks that are used to teach American history in high schools in this country. I examined a dozen of them. The most popularly used textbooks, every one of them lies about this history. The most popular American history textbook in the country, at least as of 3 or 4 years ago when I looked at them, was something called The Americans. It's 1,200 pages of American history. In those 1,200 pages, there's one paragraph with the subhead, Discrimination in the North, not segregation, but discrimination in the North, and one sentence in that paragraph that reads something along the lines as follows: in the North, African Americans found themselves forced into segregated neighborhoods. That's it. You know, they woke up one day, they looked out the window, and they said, hey, we're in a segregated neighborhood. This is a crime. Because if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than we've learned it, they're going to be as poor a position to remedy it as we've been. So one of the first things I urge you to do is, and I'm not just talking about Cambridge, I'm talking about this whole metropolitan area. You know, the problems don't primarily, they do exist in Cambridge, they don't primarily exist in Cambridge, they exist in the suburbs, and the suburbs is where they have to be addressed. But so examine the way this history is being taught. Insist that it be taught accurately, because unless the younger generation learns it, we're going to continue to be hobbled in our ability to address it. So I think I've used up my time. I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to an interesting discussion that follows. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Dante Ramos. I'm an editor and a columnist at the Boston Globe. Please join me in thanking Richard Rothstein for a great presentation just now. I think it says a lot about Cambridge that hundreds of people will show up on a rainy Tuesday night for a presentation on housing policy. So at least in that respect, don't ever change, Cambridge. Our goal for the next little bit will be to, Richard's book is obviously about history, and our goal for this next segment is to connect that history to the housing debate, the policy debate here in Cambridge, in the Boston area, and in Massachusetts. In order to do that, we have some great panelists here. Let me first introduce Crystal Cornegay, who is the Executive Director of Mass Housing. Crystal, do you want to come up? Next we have Dr. Atiya Martin, who is a Distinguished Senior Fellow at Northeastern and the former Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boston. And also David Harris, Managing Director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School and the founding former Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston. Welcome, everybody. And let me just remind you of something that Jesse said at the outset. If you have questions, I think there are note cards that are out there at any point in the presentation. Just pass them to the folks who are kind of standing in the aisles collecting them, and they'll find their way up to me, and hopefully we'll get to as many as we can. Thanks. Probably should have done a sound check earlier on. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Okay, there we go. Let me bring it a little closer. Clearly, I'm not going to be in a band anytime soon. I want to start with one of the last observations that Richard made was about this idea that African Americans found themselves in a segregated neighborhood. And for me, and everybody should read the book, it's terrific. For me, perhaps the most arresting image as a resident of the Boston area was in the discussion of Mission Hill and Mission Hill Extension. And there's a quotation in there that I'd like to begin with, where there was an observer who said, in the rental office there are two windows, one for Mission Hill and one for the extension. And except for the absence of two signs saying white in color, it might be Birmingham, Alabama. There is literally a line of whites and a line of Negroes paying their rent. I think it's a sort of a bracing starting point for this discussion, and I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists to give us your assessment based on your experience. How far along have we come from that? How much have things improved or not improved? And David Harris, since you're sitting right next to me, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you. I want to say how glad I am to be here today. So Dante, come on, tell me how to do this. Is this better?
Yes.
If you don't want to lean, you can pick up.
Walk this way.
There you go.
So I am glad to be here. I think I have mixed feelings about kind of how I respond to Richard's book, and in terms of the question as to where we are today, I do have to say that I think the lesson from Richard's book really is that our country is founded on and continues to operate based on racism. And that racism is quite simply the differential distribution of goods and resources and privilege according to race. And I think he's done a great job of helping us to understand that that includes formal government policies. And we are in a situation now where I think, sadly, when we speak of remedies and things, it's become incredibly difficult to think about remedies at this point, unless we think very, very, very broadly and creatively. So what I will say is that I think we continue to be haunted by the policies and practices that he's outlined, and the results are that we have a situation in which, if you look at kind of classic studies of residential segregation, we will be told that in order to solve that and kind of eliminate it and kind of reach the levels of integration that replicate a region in general, we would have to move 50 to 60% of African Americans. I want you to note that it's always moving the African Americans to get us to integration. But that's just not likely to be possible. So I will say, and I'll leave it as this provocative statement that I'll come back to later, that at this point segregation is not the problem. Okay, I work at a place called the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. Charles Hamilton Houston gave his career to proving that separate but equal could not be equal in this country. I would say that the full sentence is separate but equal cannot be equal in this country because of racism. And until or unless we address the question of racism, we won't be able to resolve the problems we face.
Atia Martin.
Okay, well, that's an easy question to start us off with. So, the one side of me is kind of chuckles at the question a little bit, because I think of people saying things like, well, we had a black president, right? And then there's Oprah. And, you could like list like the 5 big things and people get really, defensive about it. And I bring that up because it goes to show how far we have not come. Because when you can list off the accomplishments, those top people in society who are black and have reached the pinnacle of success in spite of racism, then we still have a lot of work to do. It's not enough to be able to list off these anecdotal situations because the numbers tell a different story. And I'd say when we talk about racism, we have to understand that it's dehumanizing, that it's within all of us, white people and people of color. And the reason, in my opinion, that we have not, and this is kind of consistent with what you said, the reason that we have not actually made the type of transformational progress that we need to make is because we haven't dealt with ourselves. We haven't dealt with the fact that regardless of what policies or practices we're talking about, that we're the ones who vote on this stuff. We're the ones who vote these people into office. We're the ones who are practicing NIMBYism. So how do we reconcile the full spectrum of the layered approaches that we need to take to address the issues that includes dealing with ourselves and policy and how our institutions are operating? And then the last thing I'll say is there is this interesting piece that was brought up around kind of how policies and practices got us here. I'm going to add to that culture, right? And in terms of culture, what's acceptable behavior and ways of thinking that lead to these perverse outcomes? Because they are perverse outcomes, they're by design. And so as we think about root causes, that in order for those policies and practices to actually take hold in the ways that they did, we had a certain way of thinking in our culture and a certain level of acceptability, and we continue to, but unintentionally. But that doesn't mean that we're not guilty, all of us, white people and people of color, for holding up the system of racism. And so I hope we talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Crystal?
I want to thank everybody for having me here as well. I can't remember what the question was.
The original question was from the days of the separate windows at the Mission Hill and Mission Hill extension.
I remember now. Thank
How
you,
far
Dante.
along? Have we made some progress, a lot of progress, no progress? Where are we at?
I think we've made some progress. I'm torn about it as well, right? But I grew up in a household where I had to hear the stories of my father growing up in Virginia and what that was like. And so my life is not like that. So I feel like, yes, we've made some progress. But I also know, but it's like, we had so far to go that because we came a little bit, doesn't mean that the progress that we've made is enough. Let me say it like that, given the amount of time that we've been through. And what the difficult part is, because it takes so long, we continue to lose generations of African Americans and leave them behind, and it further expands the gap between, not just those who have and have not on a racial basis, but those who have and have not even within the race. And that creates all kinds of tensions to which Dr. Martin was referring to.
Richard, do you want to offer an assessment?
Well, sure. I don't entirely agree with my fellow panelists. First of all, I think, I already made clear, I think segregation is the problem. It's not at all hard to think of policies that we could follow to desegregate this country. I'm actually hopeful about the story I told, because so long as we thought it happened by accident, as I said, we think it only cannot happen by accident. Once we understand that it was done by explicit government policy, there are many obvious policies that we could follow that would accomplish substantial desegregation. We could abolish exclusionary zoning ordinances in the all-white suburbs surrounding major cities. And then we could take programs like the low-income housing tax credit and the Section 8 program and require that they prioritize opportunities to move to the suburbs that presently exclude them. So there are many such policies. Before the 1960s, it was inconceivable to us that we could have abolished segregation in the other areas of life. I don't think anybody could have foreseen it. And I think it may seem inconceivable now that we could desegregate this country, but stranger things have happened. Let me just say, the very first job I ever had was in 1965, I think it was. I was a research assistant at the Chicago Urban League. And the job I had was to go through, some kind of manual of corporate structures of Chicago and identify all the policy-making positions in corporations in the city of Chicago. And I and a couple of other researchers identified 4,000 policy-making positions in the private sector in Chicago. Not a single one was held by an African American. Not a single one. At that time, fewer than 10%, something between 5 and 10% of African American young adults were college graduates. Today it's 25%. It's still far below the 40-something% of whites, but that's considerable progress that would have been inconceivable to me or to the people who are reading this report that I wrote in 1965 about the corporate sector of Chicago. So I think it's possible. The impediment we face is not the inability to think of what kinds of policies we would follow to desegregate the country. The impediment is political will and political mobilization. And that's why I keep on emphasizing we need a new civil rights movement around residential segregation. Understanding the history clearly is not going to be enough, but understanding the history has to be an important step.
Can I add just one piece?
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Because I just wanted to add that I think we're actually in agreement. We're not having a disagreement. I think what we're actually, you just said it without adding the word racism in there when we said we don't have the political will. Why don't we have the political will? Because we have all been indoctrinated and conditioned into a way of being that keeps us separated from each other. And we've gone through decades and decades and generations after generation of constant indoctrination into the other, in that we are not the same, when in fact our humanity and the things that are most important to us and the things that we need to thrive are the same, except we've been distracted by race and racism in particular from being able to connect the dots to see those common struggles, and in fact how racism hurts white people too. We can talk about that later. But just in terms of when you talk about segregation, there's a reason why there's no political will. And so to your point around understanding history, that's why your book is so amazingly important, because it's, in my opinion, one of the two main factors of why racism and the racial inequities we see continue to persist, is because we don't understand our history. We don't understand how we got to the inequities we see in communities today, and therefore we tend to get lost in individual behavior instead of the system. We put the problem on the individuals instead of the system, and that's why your book has been so incredibly powerful and important to understanding how all of these pieces come together.
I'm sorry. I do want to say, like, I am in disagreement. I appreciate the perspective, but to David's point, the whole idea behind racism is that if I'm going to have a good life, I got to live like a white person. Right? I got to live where white people live. I got to go to the schools that white people go to. And these are all systems that are designed for that culture, right? And the things that are inherent about that culture to be successful. What do they call a low-income community with mostly Italians? Little Italy. What do they call a low-income community with mostly Asians? Chinatown. What do they call a low-income community with mostly black folks? The ghetto. A concentrated poverty, right? And it's not about that there's this one race that lives there. It's this one race that lives there in which we don't invest in the school, in which the cops don't show up. We have the worst teachers. And so I would like a policy, if we're gonna do a policy, and isn't one in which we have to integrate neighborhoods, because quite frankly, I don't want to integrate your neighborhood. I would like to live and wake up and live around people who look like me, who share my culture, And why am I a bad person? Because I want to do that. I would much rather talk about policies that make the same kinds of investments in those communities that we do in other communities.
So can I?
Please.
Thank you. Crystal said a lot of it, but I do think it's really important for us to understand. I think, and Richard spoke about the need for us to understand kind of lived experience. And I would say that if we're thinking about public policy, the will we need is the will to make the kind of investments that will, in fact, remedy this situation. Okay, that's what's lacking. And the will, that has to do with, I suspect, I often say, if we were to kind of formulate public policy based on what people express as their needs, I don't think that people living in areas of concentrated poverty, so-called the ghetto, I think they want the same thing that people living in Newton and in Cambridge and elsewhere want. They want safe, affordable housing. They want communities that are thriving. We read about knowing what works. We know that thriving communities work. We know that thriving communities can help the achievement gap, blah, blah, blah. We don't, unless we're speaking code, thriving doesn't mean white. Of course, maybe it does. But the fact of the matter is, if that's our public policy, then we need to redistribute the way in which resources are allocated, and we need to start to do what Crystal's saying and invest in communities. And we don't have to, we're not going to move our way out of this. And so the final point is, I think, I spent a lot of my career thinking about and working toward eliminating racial discrimination in housing. I believe integration is a social goal that we can all share. But as a practical matter, integration is different from desegregation. And as Crystal said, moving a poor family into a suburb doesn't make that person any less poor. And it's not the solution.
So there's a lot of different strands there, and I'd like to pick up on one of them at the moment. David Harris, you mentioned our public policy, and Tia Martin, you talked about the system. You also said something kind of interesting. You talked about NIMBYism. Richard, you talked about exclusionary zoning. One of the complications on this issue, when we're talking about segregation within neighborhoods, is that decisions are made at various levels of government. And decisions were made at the high level within the Federal Housing Administration to not subsidize mortgage for black returning GIs. At the same time, these decisions about zoning, about restrictive uses of land are made very much at the local level. And I would add, in Massachusetts, we have 351 cities and towns that are very empowered, have a long history of making their own zoning decisions, some of which involve 2- and 3-acre lots. And so actually, Crystal, you've been in state government. You've also been outside state government. I'd like you to, if you can tell us, when the policy is problematic, if you want to use that term, but it exists on multiple levels, how do you come to any sort of policy solution that would actually help people do the things you want to do?
So I'm a community developer, as you can tell. So I think about things as investing in communities. I will say, and I'm also a very city girl, right? Like I'm from New York, I live in Boston, I'm very kind of urban. And as part of being in this job, my previous job, it opened me up to the idea of what it means to be hyper-local. As Dante says, we live in a state in which we have 351 zoning laws, right? Every place is different. And it's become such a huge conversation that the governor is like one of the first governors in a long time to list housing as an issue that he's confronting. But it's hard, right? Because you got 351 cities and towns, and he's got to get elected. And people don't like change, right? I don't want to presume that it's about race. I'm just saying, it's just hard to get people to change. And oftentimes, because land use is like as fundamental to our kind of American sort of ethos, the way we think, as racism is, right? It's a basic part of it's a basic part of our history. Getting people to give up the idea that they get to say what happens in that lot next door is a hard push, right? Because from elected officials, we have a system in which you got to get elected by those same people, and those are the people who think about things and remember things. And so the other thing I will say is, like, working in government, the other thing I learned is, like, change is incremental. And when you think about what kinds of changes you want to make, you can't change, 100 years of disinvestment and bad policy in one election cycle. And so what is the next increment that you're going to make? And it's great to say that we're going to do away with exclusionary zoning, but, like, you haven't been outside of Cambridge. That's not going to happen. And those meetings, those public meetings in which they have conversations that's not even, doesn't even get to those people kind of conversations. Those meetings are brutal and ugly, and people whose kids go to school together, like, it's nasty outside. And these become very fundamental kinds of emotional issues. And so for us, what we've been trying to think about is, like, what is the next, what have we done already? And how has that worked? And so what is the next thing to do to try to keep moving along this line?
David Harris, could you respond to that?
Remind me of the exact question.
I mean, the question is basically, and you've talked in very sort of big picture terms about the sort of overarching problems that you observe. We've been talking about also things that exist at multiple levels of government, places outside of Cambridge where people are going to stick to their exclusionary zoning. How do you create change in that type of a context?
So I do think that that the change is going to have to be local. I think it's interesting when I think of the word "we" in terms of public policy as what Kessler called grammatical fiction. All right, so the "we" is not really "we"; it's "they," and I think that. From my perspective, one of the most important things is for people to kind of understand this history that's been laid out here. I think that's really important, and to start to organize and mobilize around it and start to become much more involved in the public policy discussions we have. And I think if that happens, we'll see that things like asthma, for instance, right? Richard mentioned asthma. Asthma is a fair housing issue. Asthma is a housing issue. It's not a health issue. It's something that if we're going to talk about how do we address the effects of concentrated poverty, we have to talk about asthma. Right? We have to talk about resolving asthma so that you don't have to move to get away from asthma. Right? Why isn't it your fundamental right to have some health? Right? Violence, same thing. So I think, but until and unless people start to take the information that's being discussed here and mobilize and try to change. I think it's true that we need to change things on a local level. You folks here in Cambridge are doing a good job of that. You're very organized. I think that we have to do that everywhere. And the changes have to be ways that we get more people involved in the political process. I'm not a big fan of voting. I don't think voting's the cure-all, but I think there are forms of activism and engagement that we need to encourage people who have been excluded consistently across the centuries can partake of. And it is local. We're not going to change Ben Carson and HUD and all that stuff. He's going to be on his $30,000 couch
or whatever.
So Dante, yes. I mean, I think it's true. And I'll tell you one story because I told Richard I'd tell this before. But in 1968, I was a senior in high school. I was running in a track meet in California. I was running against a school called Westchester High School, which Richard mentioned, right? Westchester was one of those communities that was created for white folks, right? And on that day, April 4th, 1968, as we were getting on the bus, there was an announcement came over the loudspeaker that Martin Luther King had been shot. And people in that crowd cheered, right? That, people in that crowd cheered, and it stayed with me 50 years later. Now, the fact is, today, Westchester is all people of color, right? So things happen in this country, and they happen by race. And if we aren't, so I think, and it's local. I mean, Westchester, I'm talking about a town, right? So we really have to find ways to elevate those voices of people living in communities such that they can determine and define what their own fate is.
Richard, did you want to respond to that?
Well, I don't disagree with that. I do think that progress is possible. We have examples of it, but clearly the main thing we need is political mobilization and organization. I wasn't suggesting that abolishing exclusionary zoning was possible today, but for political reasons. But we do have, for example, New Jersey has adopted a fair share program in which every community, even the most affluent suburb, has to develop housing to include its fair share of the region's low-income population. We have an affluent community like Montgomery County outside of Washington, D.C. that has an inclusionary zoning program that requires all developers not only to set aside a share of their units for moderate income housing, but then the Public Housing Authority buys a third of those set-aside units for its public housing population. And the reality is that when families move to higher opportunity neighborhoods, their outcomes improve. A poor family living in a high opportunity neighborhood, the children have more of a chance of going to college, the adults have more of a chance of being employed, the health outcomes are better, and and progress is possible. But first we need to understand that it is possible. We need to understand that. Let me just add this one thing, if I can tell another story, if I may. Some of you bought the paperback book. The paperback book has something in it that the hardcover doesn't. And the paperback book has a discussion guide at the back of it. In the discussion guide, I describe a letter I got from a high school student, or a recent high school graduate in New Orleans. He was an African-American high school graduate. He said he grew up in a segregated neighborhood in New Orleans. It was a poor neighborhood. He looked around and he saw that black people were poor, that white people were rich. He thought that was the natural way things were going to be. And then he said he read my book, obviously in the hardcover version, and he realized that government had created this difference. This wasn't a condition of the people, it was a condition of the government, and a creation of the government. He said if he had realized that, he might have worked harder in high school. And social scientists, psychologists call that stereotype threat. But it's the opposite as well. That is, if white people come to understand how this happened, their stereotypes of African Americans might also change as well, because one of the things that happens is when you concentrate African Americans in low-income, overcrowded neighborhoods and slums develop, it's understandable that whites think of African Americans as slum dwellers. If they understand that these conditions were not the characteristics of the people, but were imposed by government, their views might change as well. So I'm not suggesting
part of why people think that is because the white media focuses on the idea that black folks live like that. Most people who live in public housing aren't black. And so some of that is all about how the system continues to perpetuate folks, low income, particularly black folks, low income, and how they live, and that kind of thing. And I'm sorry, I just go back to the idea that we need to make different investments. I grew up in a predominantly African American community, and I went to a predominantly white school. I was one of those kids, I was wicked smart, right? And so I went to one of those schools, right? I was the only black kid in the class, right? Do you know how hard that was for me at 12? Like, that's not cute. And so why, I got a decent education, whatever the case may be, but those were really, really challenging times for me. And so what is it that I have to give up? Why do I always have to give up something in order to get that thing? In order to get something that people, like, why we have universal health care, but we don't have universal housing? Why do we all fight about universal health care, but housing isn't a basic right, but everybody should have health care? I've never understood that.
Sorry. Again, there's a lot of threads going on here. I just want to check, Richard, was there one last thought that you had wanted to add to that, or?
I don't have. I've had plenty of time.
Okay. Okay.
I'm sure I'll have more.
One comment on what Chris said.
Sure.
On what Richard said. I mean, I think one of the places that we have to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about policies. I agree that we need to open up the suburbs and all that kind of stuff, but you all probably know how you get one of those prime units, right? How do you get it, right? You get on a lottery. How do you get into Metco, right? You sit on a waiting list, right? So that's public policy by lottery. That's public policy by luck. And what I'm saying is it's time for us to be a little bit more forthright about the public policies we need. And we can't leave it to luck. And it can't be for those who are lucky enough to rise to the top on a list, who are lucky enough to get an affordable mortgage, who are lucky enough to get a slot in Metco. So we might need to do all of those things, but there's a lot more we have to focus on.
Just to shift the conversation a little bit, I'd like to incorporate some questions from folks in the audience. So this question says, do you know of any cases of successful integration as a result of deliberate policy in areas that were previously residentially segregated? I guess I would expand that question to, do you, based upon your experience, know of other communities in the state, in this country, that have made an earnest and successful effort to tackle some of the problems that we've been talking about tonight? Tia Martin, you and I were talking earlier. For folks who don't know it, she was the head of the City of Boston's Resilience Initiative and did a lot of research on other communities and what stuff other places were doing. Can you give us any positive examples?
I love how he gives me the hard stuff. So I won't speak to integration per se, because I think that's not necessarily the outcome that some of the examples that we discussed are meant to address. What they're meant to address is how do we embed racial equity and social justice into how we do policies at the local level. And not just how we do policies, but also how we actually implement them, right? So we have a lot of work that's been done by organizations like the Government Alliance for Race and Equity and the Haas Institute and all these great folks who have helped to put together these types of lenses. And I think Seattle was one of the first cities to really kind of take it on and, in a deep way across all of government. Now, they made some missteps, which we worked with them and having conversations about and learning what were some of those missteps, so that as we in Boston were looking to apply some of this work that we wouldn't make. And I'd say the first one, which is something that you actually mentioned, David, which is they didn't engage the community as they put these policies in place. And so it was invisible to the community. There was no transparency to the community and limited accountability. And so that's kind of lesson from Seattle. They've had a lot of incremental progress, but because of that and the fact that they didn't account for the human factor, which is how do you make sure that on the implementation side, these policies actually are done within departments and in terms of the work product for communities. And so their gap was that they didn't actually train the frontline people who are working in government on these issues, why it was important, how it was going to make their lives easier, their jobs better, how it was going to serve the community better, and make sure they had the knowledge and skills and tools to actually do the work. And so that's just part of it. I think another great example is Oakland. So the Oakland's mayor, whose name is?
Libby Schaaf.
What is it?
Libby Schaaf.
Libby Schaaf, thank you. Mayor Libby Schaaf was, I actually was on a panel with her at South by Southwest this summer, and Oh, was that this summer? No, that was this spring. Sorry, guys. This winter, maybe. I don't know.
March.
It's all a blur. And
all of them.
It was really powerful. Some of not just, and this is why I believe that there's more that can be done than just incremental change. So they basically changed, and I'm using an anecdotal example of all of the stuff they've done in Oakland, but they changed their policy around how the police department operates. They didn't just do implicit bias training, they did that, but they also worked with officers to do more community policing. They also worked with officers to, on a continual basis, implement that type of thinking into accountability and how people were, when they were getting their reviews, make sure that was embedded in reviews. And so when we fast forward a year from the time they started that, they saw double-digit decreases in the amount of complaints from residents about police brutality or police misconduct in communities of color. They saw less stops of people of color, especially in the Black community, where there were incredibly high numbers, as it is across the country. And so by having a very strategic approach that integrated across all of government and had reinforcement through accountability, they were able to make the types of changes that we think of as transformational in like a year. So that's what keeps me optimistic and gives me hope, in addition to the fact that the work that we need to do as people becomes a fundamental barrier to implementing this work as Seattle experienced. And so without acknowledging that we fundamentally are flawed as human beings, and that's okay, that we need some humility, and that we need to manage ourselves. And the tools we need to manage ourselves are a combination of consciousness, of understanding these issues, the history, the social context, but also using critical thinking. And the last thing I'll say is that is why I brought up the issue earlier of how racism hurts white people. Because of this lack of critical thinking, because of racism, and people being able to pull the wool over their eyes to not see issues as an issue that impacts all of us, but an issue that impacts her and not you. And so we make decisions based on that. And what's happened is white people have made decisions that hurt themselves by being distracted by racism and not wanting those people to have certain things. And so it's happened generation after generation. You can go from the poll tax to the opioid crisis to Affordable Care Act versus Obamacare. You can keep going generation after generation of all this stuff happening where white people end up getting hurt by making decisions that they think are about other people when it's always about all of us, and it's going to come back and boomerang dagger and hurt you too.
Having put you on the spot just now, let me ask each of if any of our other panelists, if you knew of examples outside of Oakland and Seattle of places that had actually managed to integrate previously segregated areas. Are there national models out there that any of you know of?
Well, I mentioned two before. I mentioned the New Jersey Fair Share Plan, which it was adopted about 30 years ago and not enforced until about 3 years ago, or maybe 5 years ago. But in the last 5 years, it's demonstrated that such a program can be successful. I mentioned the Montgomery County program, which could be duplicated easily elsewhere. And research has demonstrated that the children of public housing residents who were offered positions in the units in very affluent areas in these mixed income developments do much better in school than similar children who were not offered such units. There's a community west of Chicago called Oak Park, a middle-class community, which has achieved fairly stable integration by having a very open and aggressive program of community involvement and ensuring that that integration proceeds. They've done a lot of things. They prohibit lawn signs, and for sale signs, and to prevent panic on the part of whites who are fleeing African Americans. And they've achieved stable integration. So there are, And then, well, I guess the other thing is that we have a number of court cases which challenged the segregation of public housing, and that resulted in settlements that gave public housing residents in Baltimore and Dallas and Chicago, are 3 places, gave public housing residents enhanced vouchers to move to middle-class communities, and those have been very successful.
David, you're sighing.
No, I'm just tired.
Okay. Let me try to move through some of these a little more quickly, just so people get their questions asked. How has 40B worked or failed to desegregate suburban communities? For people who don't know, 40B is a, Crystal, correct me if I'm wrong here, it is a long-established state law, sometimes controversial, often controversial, that allows communities that have not met a certain percentage of housing affordability to override certain local zoning restrictions. Have I got that right?
That's right.
So has it worked or failed?
It depends on how you define worked. 40B is the only tool in this, is the only way in the state outside of Boston where most projects get permitted. And mostly what you hear about are controversial 40Bs. But there are lots of 40B deals that happen that we sort of call friendly 40Bs. 40B has developed through the program has developed like over 60,000 units, but that's 60,000 units over 50 years. But without 40B, we're not sure any of that would have happened. And what's happening right now is, as the market has gotten hotter, particularly in Greater Boston, inside 128, you have a bunch of communities that have the wherewithal, resources, both time, money, access, that they spend a lot of time fighting 40B projects with phrases that I'm sure you all have heard. We don't mind affordable housing, but it changes the character of our community, but it's too big right there, but all these kind of things. And at the end of the day, some of it is just like, I mean, I've literally had a person in my office in tears saying to me that this 40B project was gonna really ruin the quality of that person's life. Now, so anyway, I would say the program is a success because I don't know what else we would do to get deals permitted outside of it.
So I was signed because I had a thought about the Fair Share project that was going to lead me to 40B, and I decided I wouldn't say anything. But since you ask, there are a couple of things about both of those. Those are affordable housing programs, right? Right. So I think I have a friend named Judith Lieben. Many of you might know who she is. She's one of our heroes, right? Who would always say, when it comes to a contest between affordable housing and fair housing, affordable housing wins. And what she means by that is, I would ask you, of those 60,000, how many of them are black? How many of them are of color over those 50 years? The other thing I would say is that we're conflating race and affordability here, aren't we? Right?
Yes.
So let's just admit that, right? Because 40B is about affordable housing, and we're having this conversation about integration. So are we using affordability as code for race? Well, it doesn't work, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't name race, it doesn't work. So, so again, I think if we're trying to kind of have an open and honest conversation here, we have to. We name race and not affordability. So the other thing I censored before is I'll say, I don't know a lot of successes, but I think I do know, and I think that Rich will probably attest to this, that there are a lot of formerly well-integrated communities that are now flipping and are becoming white. It's happening where I live in West Medford. It's happening here, and this man's pointing here in Cambridge. So there's a lot of movement in the other direction as well. So.
That's a great segue to another question from the audience. Today, aren't urban areas becoming magnets for more affluent and white, parentheses, young people, and are pushing out poorer urban black people? This is thought of purely as economic, not as a result of racism. How is this a legacy of government policy?
Another easy question.
So you take it.
Sure. So I think, I'll go back. So I think part of the issue is the question, the person who wrote the question is right. It is about racism at the root of it, but it's also the intersection of racism and the perverse outcomes of the wealth gap, right? In the fact that because of these housing policies, people of color, especially black people in, I'll speak to Boston, do not actually have the opportunity to own their homes. And so many people are renting. Actually, most people in Boston rent, but the percentage of ownership is lower in our community. And the reason is because of these policies, right? And I just want to be clear, because sometimes we get lost in overgeneralizations and simplifications. It doesn't mean that there aren't black people who own their homes in Boston. I just want to be clear about that. But when we're talking about these particular issues, I think part of the reason we struggle so much with it is because, again, we haven't been honest with ourselves about the reasons why it is so easy to displace people of color. So you don't want to live in a city anymore, so then displace people of color into urban environments and move out to the suburbs. Don't want to live in the suburbs anymore, displace black people and move them out to wherever places they end up that they can afford because we're ready to move back into the city. And so I struggle with how we talk about these things sometimes, and that we're not just being honest, that the root cause of this is race and racism. And it's not to say that people are doing this stuff intentionally. However, it is to say that we do have blinders on and that we're not seeing the full impact of the behavior that is unintentional. And so the last thing I'll say is, as we think about what do we do about this stuff, well, I think part of this is also about how do we promote more home ownership in communities, and people keep wanting to talk about kind of affordable housing, and yes, we need that. And we need a multi-layered strategies that are also about home ownership, even if we realize that Boston is 44.6 square miles and it's tiny. And there's not a whole lot of places for more development, but there's some places we can develop up. There's condos. So we can come up with also creative models that allow for people to start to build equity and wealth because they deserve it, because they haven't had the opportunity to, because of these policies.
Can I?
Please.
I absolutely agree. I will say this goes back to points that Richard made in his book. Part of also what's happening is that the families of color who do own their homes and see that as a way to sort of build equity for them and their children, they're selling their homes, right? And that's the way the system is supposed to work. But because we've made cities safer, then folks who live in the suburb, it's okay to live in the urban environment. And because those folks have this kind of generational wealth that was created from these, decades of housing policy, they can afford to buy the house at a market cost. And that's part of what's also going on in terms of gentrifying neighborhoods. And so we've got to have that balance as well in terms of people of color sort of now in this position in which they're kind of gaining from the system that we've designed in terms of how you're supposed to grow your wealth. But we also have banking policies that are, you know, like you need X kind of credit score, and maybe your house didn't appraise at the right thing. And those are also reasons why people of color, I mean, they're much more subtle in terms of policies. That those are reasons why people of color aren't in a position necessarily to do home ownership. And one of the reasons that Mass Housing started its down payment assistance program was to try to start to get at that thing. It's a small step, again, to try to get some equilibrium, because I agree that if we're going to talk about, we always talk about workforce housing and middle income housing, and I'm a big proponent of middle-income housing should be home ownership. And we really shouldn't be thinking about building rental units for middle-income folk.
Well, gentrification, I don't know anything about particular about the neighborhood that David lives in, but gentrification generally creates temporary integration as it's changing from, as neighborhoods that are African American change from being African American to partly white and increasingly more white. There are two problems that need to be addressed. One is, how do you preserve a share of housing in those neighborhoods? You can't preserve all of it, because then you wouldn't have any whites moving in. But how do you preserve a share of housing in those neighborhoods for previous residents? People who own their own homes, for example, in those neighborhoods don't sell them necessarily out of desire. They sell them because they can't afford to live in them anymore because their property taxes are going up. So we can freeze property taxes for existing homeowners. California did that with Prop 13. There are problems with that, and they're easily modified to avoid the problems. But so that's one thing you could do to preserve a share of housing for existing residents, so homeowners in those communities don't have to sell their homes. You could limit condominium conversions. You could have rent control. There are a whole series of policies you could do to preserve housing for opportunities for people who previously lived there. And there's a lot of discussion of that, and that's when we talk about gentrification, that's what people are focused on, is how do you do that. But the bigger problem is that even if you did that, most people who live in that neighborhood would be displaced. And where do they go to? Well, they typically go to newly segregated communities, inner ring suburbs, which have many of the same problems of lack of opportunity that the previous neighborhoods they're being displaced from. So unless you address the exclusivity of suburbs, of all white suburbs, and create high opportunity areas for the people who will inevitably be displaced to live, then you can't have stable gentrification. It's not a new problem. You know, gentrification is just a fancy new name for what we used to call urban renewal. And typically, urban renewal resulted in displacement of African Americans from urban areas to newly segregated, equally low opportunity areas. When, you know, after Ferguson happened, people wondered, how did Ferguson, as a suburb, become majority black place? Well, it became majority black because when urban renewal took place in downtown St. Louis, there was no place where people who lived in those neighborhoods could move except for one or two suburbs like Ferguson. They would accept African American residents. And so after Ferguson happened, this is a good example, after Ferguson happened, the City Council of St. Louis adopted an ordinance, a big reform ordinance, to prohibit discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders. That was their big reform. It's a good thing to do, but the problem exists in St. Louis County, not in St. Louis City. And St. Louis County didn't adopt a similar ordinance. So the gentrification that is going on in St. Louis on top of the early urban renewal is not going to result in stable integration either in the city or in the suburbs.
It's funny. I was listening and I was thinking as you were speaking, Richard. There's kind of some reverse tipping going on here. I mean, I feel like, you know, whites come in and you said there goes a neighborhood, right? All these white folks come in and and it's true, there goes a neighborhood. You know, you're about to lose it, folks, as the prices go up. But I will tell you one thing about where I live. I'll tell you about West Medford. West Medford was the only place in Medford where black people could live at one point. Right? Over the last century, there developed a thriving middle class there. Right? There are pictures of black folks from West Medford in City Hall. There's a school named after one of the residents there. It's a rich, vibrant community. But the other day, my son was doing a project for school. He was interviewing people about the neighborhood, and there was a guy there who had moved from Cambridge 50 years ago. And he talked about the change in the neighborhood. And I remember when we bought our house, we're fortunate, we ran into some realtors who would say to us, and say to people, we're telling our clients from Cambridge to come out to Medford because it's much cheaper. You can get as much out here as you can pay for a condo in Cambridge. And that's the problem. The problem is people getting priced out. And what's happening in West Medford, and it's happening in other communities of color with middle class, with vibrant middle classes, is that they're getting priced out, and the people coming back in are not black, and it's tipping, literally.
I regret that as we get closer to the end of our period here, that each of you in your own way has touched upon what I think in Cambridge and in Massachusetts is one of the deepest policy debates of all. David, you're talking about people being priced out and talking about realtors showing up and the sort of trepidation that exists in certain communities about that. Tia, you mentioned creative things that might be done, including building up. One of the issues that I think is dear to ABC's heart, it's certainly something that I've written about in my own work, is this question of creating more reducing prices by creating more supply of housing, including by building up. It's something that was the subject, it's often the subject of local rezoning. It was the subject of a major controversial piece of legislation in California that, Richard, if I read correctly, you were a supporter of. But it's also something that, in a lot of communities, in minority neighborhoods in particular, has been greeted with a great deal of suspicion. The notion that the private real estate market, the realtors sort of circling on the horizon, that is something that could be a tool towards equity, I think, to say generously, is greeted with suspicion in many communities. And I wonder, I wonder if there's anything that any way that might be remedied, any way to change the debate in a more positive way.
So is the question, I just want to make sure I understand the question.
It was a gauzy one.
Regardless.
So say it one more.
So I think the question is, we have had this debate. It's a debate that often comes up in Cambridge about housing prices, to which David alluded. And that is the question of, we should lower housing prices or try to get housing prices under control by building up, by deregulating, by letting perhaps affordable housing and public housing and social housing do some of the work, but also by letting the private market do some of the work. That is also something that in many neighborhoods is an intensely controversial proposition because of the fear of realtors and developers circling around. There's not a lot of trust there. Can that get better?
Increasing production is what
Increasing production, yes.
Gotcha. Okay, there we go. So, increasing production. So yes, we should. Yes.
Come on, say more.
And
Say more.
Will you embellish upon that?
Will I embellish some more? I will. Okay. The pressure. So I think part of the challenge and opportunity is for the residents who live in communities to actually be respected and to be part of any process that is about how we're going to change the landscape in a way, oh, thank you, in a way that is also a learning experience, because part of the challenge is we don't always understand all of the dynamics and forces and things going on with issues, and then we get thrown into conversations to talk about it, and we're kind of talking past each other because we're not on the same page about the facts of the issues, the opportunities, the barriers we're going to have to hurdle over, how it's going to impact the community, all of those pieces. So I think that's an important part of it, a community development approach to, just to give a shout out to my girl over here. So all that said, I think the other layer of this is to also figure out how to use some even more creative practices that are also going to help people keep their homes. For those people who are homeowners, there's some really interesting and creative work happening in pockets of communities that are community-driven opportunities, like figuring out how to help older adults who own their homes get supported with better estate planning, so their home just doesn't dissipate into the ethos and then gets bought up, and then folks are surprised to wake up the next morning and find themselves in weird situations, right? And I say the other, another example is before someone sells their home in a neighborhood to someone who doesn't live in the neighborhood, or before it goes on the open market, that a local market is created where folks who live in the neighborhood actually have first dibs on being able to buy those homes if possible. So kind of there's some things that are happening, and these are things happening in Boston, where folks are testing out these different approaches. So I think, again, in multi-layered strategic approaches, that there isn't one silver bullet answer, that we have to look at all of these different pieces.
Richard, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Well, sure.
Briefly, I would say.
Huh?
Briefly, I would say.
Yeah. Well,
like
as you said, there was this enormous controversy in California recently where some of the YIMBY groups, the Yes in My Backyard groups, got a bill presented in the legislature that would prohibit single-family zoning within 1 mile of transit stops. Now, you have to understand that in California, well, as I guess here in the Boston area, rapid transit goes through some very affluent communities. And what this would increase density, their motivation was not primarily integration, racial integration. The motivation was simply providing housing for all of the tech workers who couldn't find housing that was affordable, and increasing density is their only way. So that proposal was supported. I'm sorry. That proposal was supported by the YIMBY groups. It was supported by developers who wanted to provide housing in single-family zoned areas for townhouses and low-rise apartments, and by integration advocates. It was opposed by, of course, the NIMBYs, the single-family homeowners in these suburban communities, and by the low-income housing developers and their supporters in minority communities. And it goes back to the same story I told earlier in my talk about Paul Douglas. It is obviously going to be easier to build housing for low-income families if you keep it in low-income neighborhoods. If you start opening up and place higher-income neighborhoods to low-income housing and place a priority in that, and it's going to be harder. You have to face community opposition. It's going to be harder to build it. And this is the same debate that Paul Douglas raised. Were African Americans in the 1950s better off with segregated housing than with no public housing at all? He thought they were. I think that the price we've paid for that is too high. And that's the debate that's still going on today.
On that note, I'd like to close. Let me ask our panelists, in 10 words or less, one personal action item or state action item. If you could urge people in this audience to do one thing, what would you have them do? David Harris?
10 words or less. 10 words or less.
Support the current effort to reform our zoning laws.
Atia?
Consciousness, learn about these issues, what it means to you and your family. It's not going to be 2 words, sorry. Critical thinking, what it really means, and community. This is hard work and we need each other, and all the folks who think in similar ways and are trying to strive for this work to be connected to one another to be able to continue to do it.
Richard, I want to give Crystal the last word.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
10 words or less. Ensure that this history is taught properly in your schools.
Crystal?
Don't think you know what's best for other people.
Please join me in giving a hand to our panel. And I just want to invite Adrienne Musgrave up for one final comment.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm so happy that you guys are here. My name is Adrienne. I'm a volunteer ABC member who has helped to put this on, working on it since last September. So I cannot thank you enough for being here. And I can't thank our panelists enough for the excellent conversation that we need to continue having. And I think we have a lot of personal responsibility here in this room, and the fact that you've taken your Tuesday night to be here is a good step in the right direction. And think about how many people are in your own network who maybe will be inspired and informed by what we've heard tonight and what we're learning, and how we can continue to make positive change for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much.